Good evening, everyone. Good evening. My name is Matt Ewalt, and I serve the Texas Tribune as Senior Director of Events and Live Journalism. Welcome to those joining us in person here at Austin Central Library in downtown Austin, and those joining us online for our live recording of the Tribune's podcast, TribCast, focused tonight on education and the legislative session. Our program tonight will run an hour with 45 minutes for our conversation and 15 minutes for audience Q&A. We'll be doing all Q&A through our Q&A portal at texastribune.org/ask. That's both for our audience here in Austin and those joining us from around the state. For those online, you'll see a URL at the bottom of the screen throughout the program. And for those in person, you'll even find a QR code right here so you can submit your questions. And if you're old school, we can give you some note cards and you can write them down. A note that today's conversation is also eligible for continuing professional education credits for Texas educators. Through the Association of Texas Professional Educators, you can learn more by visiting atpe.org/Tribune. We are grateful for the support of our sponsors. Our major sponsors tonight are Raise Your Hand Texas and the Texas American Federation of Teachers. We also want to thank and acknowledge Penn America Austin chapter. Please note that while sponsorship provides critical support for the Tribune, sponsors play no role in programming or the line of questioning for Tribune events. We also want to thank our host, the Library Foundation, and the staff at Austin Central Library for hosting us in this really beautiful event space. I turn the program over to Tom Oney, Board President for the Library Foundation, who will offer a quick welcome.
Thank you, Matt. I appreciate that. As he mentioned, good evening. My name is Tom Oney. I'm president of the board of the Austin Public Library Foundation. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to the Austin Central Library, as well as those of you online throughout the state who are joining us online for this edition of the TribCast Live Education and Legislative Session. At the Austin Public Library's nonprofit partner, the Library Foundation enhances the library experience for the entire community by providing financial support for our library programs and services. Central to our vision is a library that brings the community together for constructive discussion and healthy exchange of ideas, which is why we are so happy to host you here tonight. For more information on what we do and how you can help, please visit our table in the back of the room for those of you here in person, or visit us online at theaustinlibrary.org. Thank you again, and we're glad to have you here.
Tom, thank you so much. On behalf of the Tribune, I want to thank all of those around the state who make the journalism of the Tribune, including events like this, possible by becoming Texas Tribune members. Let's just see a quick show of hands for those here in Austin who are members. Raise your hand. That's great. To learn more, to become a member, you can visit texastribune.org/support. I also just want to acknowledge two of my Tribune colleagues, service and engagement reporter Maria Mendez from our audience team and Emily Iazetti, our membership manager, both of whom you'll find here at our event in person, sharing information about the Tribune and how we serve Texans and Texas communities. As the Tribune service and engagement reporter, Maria works on efforts to better connect with Texans in writing explainers and guides for the Tribune, strives to answer Texans' questions about politics and public policy, and to help them find resources. Emily oversees the membership program for the Tribune, which is critical for us to deliver on our mission to inform and engage Texans. And like Maria, is focused on engaging and listening to Texans and really hearing what they need from us at the Tribune. So I hope you'll take a sec to meet Maria and Emily tonight. And then last plug here, earlier this week, we announced our second batch of speakers for the 2025 Texas Tribune Festival. Among those joining us in downtown Austin, November 13th through 15th, are Margaret Spellings, former U.S. Secretary of Education, Michael Curry, former presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, former U.S. Representative Beto O'Rourke of El Paso, and Austin-based entrepreneur Joe Lonsdale, who in 2021 also became the foundation chairman of the University of Austin. Education is, of course, a big focus for us at TribFest, so I'd encourage you to go to tribfest.org, take a look at our lineup, and hope you can join us in November. And let's now get to tonight's program, a live recording of TribCast focused on what the 2025 legislative session means for education and libraries. Rather than do formal introductions from here, I'm going to turn the program over to our host, Eleanor Klibanoff, law and politics reporter for the Tribune. Eleanor.
Thank you. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the TribCast live from the Austin Central Library. We're so excited to be taking this show on the road. I'm Eleanor Klibanoff, law and politics reporter at the Texas Tribune, joined as always by my co-host, editor-in-chief Matthew Watkins.
Hello, Eleanor.
Hello. This is quite weird to be out in the real world.
Now we will actually be able to see people not laughing at our jokes live.
It's not going to be good for our egos, I'll tell you that. Well, we're very excited for this conversation because education has been at the center of the political conversation for the last few months, with state leaders making a lot of political hay out of what they think teachers and students need. But most of these lawmakers have not been inside a classroom since probably their high school graduation, or perhaps a little earlier than that for some of them. So to understand the view from inside the classroom, we're joined by the Texas Tribune's K-12 reporter, Jaden Edison. Jaden, thanks for joining us.
Hello. Thank you.
Your fans.
Oh, appreciate you for having me, yeah.
And Chris Mihalsik, who teaches advanced placement environmental science at Westwood High School in Round Rock, and most importantly, is the 2025 TXTOTY, or the Texas Teacher of the Year. Chris, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
She's been saying that all day, by the way.
I've been doing the
it's been practicing all day.
TXTOTY thing.
Yeah.
Is part of being the teacher of the year being able to handle unruly crowds? Can we rely on you if
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
I can make sure everybody stays calm.
Use your teacher voice. Yes.
We do a crowd surf at the end.
Well, Christine, really, thank you for joining us, and congratulations on this honor. I mean, to start, tell us a little bit about what it means to even be the Teacher of the Year and sort of what that means to you.
So being a Teacher of the Year for a state is really about being of service to the educators of your state. We call it our year of service. So I've been talking to people. This is my first real big podcast though, so I'm excited to be here, and really just amplifying teacher voice and student voice across Texas.
Great, well, thank you so much for that. And as I understand it, you also get to now compete at the National Teacher of the Year competition?
I was in the running.
You were in the running.
But
Ashley
sorry. Crossan won. She's the Pennsylvania Teacher of the Year. She's phenomenal.
Damn it. Ashley Crossan, we are coming for you.
No, she's pretty nice.
No, I'm sure she's amazing. Well, we want to get into the details of what this big legislative session for education will mean for teachers. $8.5 billion flowing into public schools. And Chris, maybe you can sort of start us off actually and give us sort of the state of affairs, how you've seen, what we've heard over the last couple of months has been, decades of underfunding of public schools. How have you seen that impact you, teachers like you, and students statewide?
I think the biggest thing that we've noticed, especially the last 2 years after funding was not passed the last legislative session, is a huge increase in class sizes. So 2 years ago, our science classes used to be capped at 28 students, and we'd cap our freshman biology at 24 because they're kind of rowdy, they need more help. And then not this last school year, but the year before, our cap was at 30. And then this last school year, the 24-25, our cap was at 34. So in the last 2 years alone, we've had, 6 more students per classroom. And that means lots of extra grading. You have to be very mindful to keep things safe in a science lab. Really lots of impact on teacher workload.
So you had 34 people in a class teaching biology.
Our biology, we tried to cap our freshman biology classes a little smaller. They were at 30. But yeah, my fourth block class, who I loved, they're amazing humans, but there are a lot of large athlete senior boys in there. And it was crowded. My classroom is not built for 34, large humans.
Right, all experiencing the high school live. That's a lot.
Yeah, a lot. You got to be mindful with the science safety with that many folks.
What difficulties does that pose? I'm curious, like in terms of, when you have smaller versus bigger, I imagine it may be more difficult to have individualized kind of attention.
Oh, 100%. The ability to really give deep individual feedback to 34 students times, my 5 classes of AP Environmental Science versus 28 kids. That's a whole extra section of kids that we're trying to, still give the very best possible education we can to. An English teacher at my school put it really well. He's like, I used to teach, when I give essays, it used to take me 7 hours to grade my AP English essays. And now with the larger class sizes, it takes me 9.5.
Wow, yeah. Jaden, as I understand it, at least according to our legislators, this is all going to be fixed now. Everything's resolved, $8.5 billion. Tell us a little bit about, where that money is going to and, how far is that going to take us to restore what some of this underfunding has done?
Yeah, so I've been talking to superintendents and teachers all week, and I can tell you, based off those conversations, there's still a lot of work to be done. It is $8.5 billion in really targeted investments, right? I think what makes this bill different from years past is the difference between flexibility and restrictions on how districts can use the funding. And so particularly, you see a huge chunk of the bill specifically focused on teacher pay, right? I know Governor Greg Abbott and other leaders in the legislature have made that a top priority, right? In terms of recognizing that obviously, who's in the classroom greatly has an outsized impact on student success as it relates specifically, to the classroom. I mean, we're going to see, a huge overhaul in the way that Texas funds special education, which is going to be huge. Those will go into effect next school year, which the commissioner, Mike Morath, will have, time, between the bill going into effect September 1 this year and the following year to kind of craft what that system is going to look like. A lot of investment in educator preparation because of the rise in uncertified teachers. Actually, we'll see that teachers without formal classroom training will actually be phased out of foundational, classes. So social studies, science, math, reading by the year 2030. There's investment in school safety. So it's a pretty comprehensive bill. I mean, it's 231 pages. Someone fact check me if I'm pretty sure I'm right. 231 pages.
You would know.
Of legislation.
No one here can fact check you.
Yeah, you're right. But going back to it, I think the biggest thing though is, I think districts are generally grateful for the money. Though I do think that they also went into it hoping for more flexibility than what they ultimately ended up with.
I'm quoting from the Raise Your Hand Texas briefing that came after that. $8.5 billion is not even half of the $19.5 billion that would have been needed simply to maintain schools' purchasing power since 2019. And so I think it is simultaneously true that this is the biggest individual kind of cash infusion growth in school funding in the state, while also possibly true that a lot of people in the education community are saying there still needs to be more that needs to be done here. And I think also talking about how a lot of that money is prescriptive, right? It's been an interesting political shift over the time that I've been involved in covering Texas politics in the way that a lot of our state leaders have talked about education and educators as well. There was a lot of kind of rancor and concerns being raised by superintendents and other people in the education community about the lack of funding or the need for funding. And you saw lawmakers, in some cases kind of turn the blame back at the superintendents and saying, this isn't the result of us not funding you enough. This is the result of you not being responsible with money that was coming in, including money that was designated for COVID and things like that. And then, you also just see, I think, a much more of a willingness of lawmakers to sort of question the effectiveness or whether even you should send your kids to public schools, right? We'll get to vouchers here in a little bit. But I think you could maybe see that reflected in a little bit in how this wasn't just, here's an $8.5 billion blank check to the school districts to spend as you see fit, but here's how you're going to spend this money. You're going to spend it on teacher pay. I'm sure you probably are okay with that idea.
Yeah.
But,
a raise is good.
And various other things, as opposed to just increasing, as the popular term, the basic allotment, right? Which would have allowed people to spend that money the way they chose.
Right, and I think the big thing to note with the flexibility component, as much as it has to do specifically, obviously, with classroom instruction and raises, a big thing is operational costs, which we know since 2019, the last comprehensive education funding bill, we've seen inflation go through the roof, and so the basic allotment, this kind of flexible funding mechanism that districts are calling for is just as much to try to keep up and pay for bus fuel, right? To make sure they have money to address the needs specific to their campuses, and kind of what their argument is that when you're giving us specific funding, you're assuming that we all have the same issues, right? As opposed to this district in West Texas has significant differences from what's happening in Houston ISD, right? And so it's been a really interesting thing to kind of observe, kind of the kind of back and forth over the course of the session.
Can we talk a little bit about teacher recruitment, retention, and pay here? I mean, that's a big part of HB2, the funding bill. There's two different factors here. There is the teacher pay raises, but there's also this effort to address what has been a concern in the education community about teachers coming in who did not have the sort of traditional training to become teachers and everything like that. I'm curious, in your experience, whether that was something you noticed as a teacher, that more uncertified teachers were coming in, and if so, was it a problem? How did you experience or witness that as an educator out there in the field?
So I'm also the science department chair in our school, and our school is very big on teacher leadership. So I've been in a lot of interviews in the last 4 years of folks coming in wanting to be a teacher. And we have been forced to hire somebody that's not been certified. We had somebody leave 2 years ago, 2 weeks before school started, to be an assistant principal, and we had to fill that position. And it is very hard to hire anybody at all 2 weeks before school starts. So we had a long-term sub for 6 weeks, and we hired somebody that was uncertified. She had a PhD in biology. And she was fabulous with the content, but not having any classroom experience, classroom management, planning. She did not serve our teenagers. She did not engage with our students. She did not serve our teenagers. So she did not make it through the year, so we had to hire someone else. We had the same thing happen last year. We had somebody leave to be an instructional coach, and I'm always happy when people can move up in education, but it's tough to find people in July. And we had somebody that was not uncertified, had not been in a classroom before, it didn't last very long. So there is huge value in having those folks come in that are certified, that have gone through a program where they've interacted with teenagers before they get to us. And then it puts a huge burden on the teachers that have to work and mentor them and train them. Our mentor teachers were often spending 2 of their 5 off blocks a week directly working with teachers, trying to get them up to speed. And mentorship is amazing, but that was extensive mentorship because they just didn't have any experience with teenagers. So from my perspective, I want a good certified teacher in every classroom in Texas. And passing this and then hopefully strengthening our pipeline will really help, I think.
Well, and I want to talk about the other side of that, which is retaining qualified teachers. You've been in the field 23 years. I'm sure you've probably would not have been Texas Teacher of the Year your first year. What has been?
Oh no!
What is the benefit of having teachers who have been doing this for a long time? I mean, for in your specific classroom, but also you're talking about becoming a mentor teacher.
Oh, the things that you learn along the way. Even I started teaching AP Environmental Science 8 years, I think, into my career. And even my first year, I was kind of horrible then, too, even though I knew how to manage students and work with them. I forgot 2 of the 6 major air pollutants, when I was teaching them. So
2 of the 6 major air pollutants?
Yeah.
Wow.
Luckily, it didn't come up as an essay
You're lucky you
question.
didn't get fired right
Yeah,
there.
no.
Is this why Pennsylvania,
Yes.
they went back and checked the
They
notes?
checked the record,
Yes.
and Pennsylvania managed all 6 of them. But no, there's so much value in getting better in your job and becoming a master teacher. You learn where the student misconceptions are. You learn how to help other people in your field grow. Those are the ones that are running our major clubs, right? Like our National Honor Society, that type of thing. So retention, I think, there's been a lot of focus on let's just get any human into the classroom. And I think really the focus needs to be how do we retain our good teachers? How do we keep them? The raise helps. What else do we need to do?
Which is what ultimately created where we're at right now, right? Is that, you had so many teachers that left the profession. Mm-hmm. And so, I think, what we found is that, through kind of particular legislation passed, intended for one thing, ended up becoming a lifeline for many districts, in terms of now, I'm able to bring in teachers because, qualified teachers are leaving the classroom. So it's interesting that this is a focus for lawmakers, because in a lot of ways, it was a problem they created, but almost it was unintended, given the law that passed that allowed kind of the exemptions, for certification. So.
Well, and one of the things I found, we did an entire episode of the TribCast about uncertified teachers and that sort of issue. And one of the things I found so interesting from that was like teachers who maybe would have otherwise gotten certified, who are now saying, well, if I get paid the same and I don't have to do all this training, like, I'll just go in the classroom and figure it out as I go. So it's a disincentive even to teachers who might want to get certified if that's not required. So briefly walk us through like what the provision is, like they'll have to phase this out.
Right, and they'll phase it out, so that'll be by 2030. That'll be, I forget the specific date, but it'll be 2030 when the commissioner, when he can no longer allow exceptions to, so it'll be a gradual kind of phase out. But the other important thing to note is that now, teachers will be able to be compensated, teacher candidates will be able to be compensated for going through high quality preparation programs, right? Whether that be, this new kind of apprenticeship model that has come around and gained a lot of traction in recent years, which basically, I've actually visited one of these in Hutto, where they're kind of really cool when you go up and see them. It's basically, you have these teacher candidates who spend, considerable amount of time in the classroom working with a veteran teacher, kind of learning under their wing. And so what they're trying to do, again, is to gradually kind of phase out these teachers, specifically, again, I should clarify, in these core foundational subjects, reading, math, science, social studies, while also incentivizing teachers to go through quality training programs and get them on a pathway to certification.
And then the other thing is to keep them, as you already mentioned, right? And a big part of that is teacher raises, right? And so I'm reading this from a story that Jaden wrote, so properly attributing
Again,
here.
fact check him if he's wrong. Fact check him if he's wrong. We do public fact checking.
Yeah. So districts teachers in school districts with more than 5,000 students with 3 to 4 years experience get a $2,500 raise, $5,000 raise for 5 or more years experience. That increases to $4,000 and $8,000 if you're in a smaller district, more likely a rural district where attracting teachers is more challenging. So my question to you is, I know this probably happened after school is out, and but what is the feeling among the teachers you talk to? What is your feeling about this? Is this enough? Is this going to change things in terms of keeping teachers around or incentivizing people to join the profession?
I think it feels a little bit like just some respect for the profession. Like, we realize you are not being paid. A lot of teachers have side hustle jobs. We grade essays in the summer. We mentor a lot of teachers, and math especially, tutor. So it feels respectful. Like, we're acknowledging that we haven't had a teacher raise in a while. Our district gives teacher raises, but this is probably the biggest raise I've ever gotten as an educator in my 23 years, and once. Yeah.
I was talking to actually a teacher today in a district. There are about 830 students total in their district, so very rural community. And it was interesting because she's been teaching for like 24 years as well. So, we were talking and she's like, this all sounds great, but I'll believe it whenever my paycheck actually increases. So
not a lot of faith. Not a lot of
so
faith.
It's really interesting. But to me, it was funny. I laughed, but it highlighted kind of somewhat of this kind of distrust. You've gone, so long with the kind of back and forth between the ISDs and lawmakers about, adequate funding, and that I think some people, teachers, and maybe you could speak to this, are kind of just fatigued and are just like, hey, if it's going to happen, it'll happen. When my superintendent or principal tells me I'm getting a raise, I'll believe it. But for right now, I'm just going to sit back and keep doing what I'm doing.
Yeah, I think certainly. I think I remember, 2 years ago when the funding sort of fell apart, that there was a lot of sort of teachers who were like, I was sort of banking on that. I kind of thought that was happening. I would imagine this time around a lot more skepticism and a lot more wait till I see it.
Yeah, for sure. I think with the way the bill is structured, it'll be quite some time before I think the story's actually written on House Bill 2, because there are these kind of new funding mechanisms. One, I think districts have to actually get the money in their hands and kind of realize, understand kind of, what's allowed here. How can I use this money there, right? Because of the different restrictions and whatnot. So I think people are generally grateful right now. But again, there's a lot of time, I think, until, again, the verdict will be out on whether the money did what it was intended to do and what lawmakers ultimately hope it will accomplish.
How would you compare, you said you've been a teacher for 23 years. How would you compare teacher morale right now compared to earlier in your career?
Well, I think my first couple of years I was pretty clueless. I was just trying to kind of make it happen. But I think the last 2 years, teacher morale is lower than I've ever seen it, probably. The increase in class size, the feeling that there was plenty of money in the rainy day fund last legislative session and nothing was done because vouchers didn't get passed. I think teachers are struggling a little bit right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think COVID, hit everyone pretty hard, obviously, in many sectors, but I think teachers really are dealing with the long tail of that, for sure. I do want to talk about what you alluded to and sort of what has gotten in the way of these sort of deals in previous sessions and what really, if we're being honest about the political process, got this money over the finish line this time, which is that it was tied to passing, Texas's very significant voucher program. Texas now has the largest day one voucher program in the country, $1 billion to allow families to receive about $10,000 per child to send them to private schools. Talk about a bill where the story is yet to be written a little bit, but Jane, tell us a little bit about, do we have any sense of what the impact will be on public schools from this long term?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's always a lot of focus on kind of, enrollment in particular. What we see in other states, you haven't seen kind of this mass exodus that people anticipate. What I always draw attention to, I think, though, is going to be funding, right, in particular. And so what I mean by that is, the state won't always be operating at what's the surplus now, 25 billion, somewhere along those lines. And so, you have $1 billion right now, toward this particular program, which we know will grow in size as the program kind of grows in future years as lawmakers allocate more funding toward it. When you get in a situation where, you are in a budget crunch, where do you cut from, right? Is it public education, right, which, really is the heart and foundation of Texas communities, really all across the state, right? We all know Friday Night Lights, and particularly in our rural communities where, these are major employers for families and whatnot, or do you cut from, the voucher program? So that's where it's more interesting to me, per se, not as much enrollment, because again, I don't think you're going to see this mass exodus, and that's just looking at evidence in other states that have implemented, these large what they call universal programs. But certainly, when it comes to budgetary decisions in the future, again, right now, there was $8.5 billion in HB2. There are people probably in this room, lawmakers, who said that, it should have been 9.5. You pulled the money from the voucher program,
sure.
right? So that's where I think the conversation gets really interesting.
Yeah.
I think the thing that I particularly will be watching will be demand for these, right? Because if you do the math, right, the number of private school students right now, if you multiply that by around 10,000, which is around how much a voucher will be worth, that number is more than $1 billion, right? And so are we going to see a situation where demand for these vouchers is immediately more than what the supply is available? And if so, what are lawmakers going to do about it? There was a thing, I think it was the Legislative Budget Board put out an estimate that, this could quickly escalate to $4.8 billion by 2030. There was a lot of pushback among the lawmakers on that and saying, they're not basing this prediction on anything. We make the decision as to whether we increase it. And I think if demand does significantly outpace supply, how much pressure will there be to expand the program, and will they want to do that? And if so, that's where you might see it start to be more expensive. If not, I think $8.5 billion, I think a lot of school districts would take $8.5 billion with a $1 billion voucher program. They'll look back at this and see it as successful. But we just don't know how that's going to play out yet. You can guess, but we'll have to just see.
One quick thing that's interesting to note, I've been watching, following closely Tennessee because this year they actually, passed their voucher program, and the implementation is kind of now in play, and so they've already seen, at the onset, more applications than spots available, and so you have to imagine. I mean, a state the size of Texas, right? You're gonna again. Think about it. I mean, if you're a family that has children enrolled in private schools already, right? This makes all the sense in the world for you to apply, right? And I'm sure, the schools will be advertising it, right? So the one thing that makes Texas unique is that there is this kind of gap year to kind of really build the program out and to get kind of awareness out there. Because usually, you might see, like in Tennessee, for example, you pass the program, it's going to be implemented, the next school year around. This time around, we have until 26-27 school year. The comptroller who oversees the state's finances will be kind of ironing things out, between September and May of next year. So there is a lot, to your point, that has to kind of get figured out. But it'll be really interesting to see, given the size of Texas and where we are. Yeah.
Chris, I mean, how are public school teachers feeling about this? I mean, what is the, you talked about the raise feeling like respect from lawmakers. How is this voucher program sort of being received?
Obviously, most public school teachers would prefer the money go to public school kids. I think the big issue that sticks in a lot of teachers' craw is that the rules aren't the same. Now that private schools are getting public taxpayer dollars, they should have to play by the same rules we do, right? Like they should have to hire certified teachers, and they don't. They should have to get their attendance allotment day by day like we do. We have average daily attendance, and we get based on how many kids are in our class every day, and there just seems to be getting the $10,000. It just doesn't feel like we're playing by the same rules. There's no real accountability system that we have to give the star and then we get rated A through F. Is there going to be an A through F for the private school? Is there going to be star accountability? I mean, it sounds like no. So it doesn't feel fair now that public funds are going to private schools that they don't have the same level of accountability we do.
And I think a lot of this sort of, and Matthew sort of alluded to this, is in this larger thing of like lawmakers seemingly at odds with public schools, or wanting more oversight, wanting more, sort of just a little bit of like what seems like a fundamental like distrust of the schools and of what's being taught in the schools, and the amount of sort of control they have over all of that. I do want to talk about sort of, did you have something on vouchers before we?
Well, no, I mean, I was just going to say, like, there's two arguments that were pushed for this. One is that, right? Like, you saw Governor Abbott go around the state and talk about, a concern that a lot of parents have about what, values are being taught to their students, right? And this, he says, gives them a choice to go seek a school that more aligns with their values. The other one would be, I mean, the case that they make, whether you agree with it or not, is that if that the accountability system for school vouchers is the sort of free market system, right? If you don't think this school is doing well at teaching your kid, you can go and send your kid to another school, whether that's leaving a public school to a private school, or a private school to a charter school, or all those different types of things. And, we will see what happens and whether those outcomes improve. We're now at the moment where it's just kind of like it's happening,
right,
and let's see how it goes.
It's like two core tenets of the current governing party in Texas, which is free market and stamp out liberal indoctrination. I mean, these are two, if anything, the latter is sort of at times rising in influence over the former. I do want to talk about some of those bills that did sort of purport to stamp out that liberal indoctrination or give parents more oversight over that. A big one, is about libraries themselves, school libraries. Going forward, parents through the school board, but really, the premise of this bill was that parents will have more say over the books that are on school library shelves going forward, rather than librarians themselves. This builds on legislation from last session that aimed to do something sort of similar. Jaden, we saw a lot of pushback to this bill from Democratic lawmakers. I watched some of these hearings. A lot of librarians showed out in full force. That's honestly a terrifying group to piss off, is what I learned from that. talk a little bit about what the impact of that bill is and sort of how that fits into this larger narrative around, giving parents more say in the classroom.
Yeah, it's really interesting. What it reminds me of, I've been back here in Texas. It'll be a year actually coming up here in a couple weeks, and it just reminds me. I was watching somewhat unrelated, but very much connected. A state board of education meeting. Maybe this was around this time last year, and there was a parent who was basically an activist, right? And she showed up. She's like one of the only people who's testifying during like the public speaking portion, and she's just like harping at the State Board of Education members for the lack of remedy, what she feels when it comes to books, and she's reading off the most explicit, like vulgar things, excerpts from books. What's interesting is the same person is testifying, during public hearings here this year during the session. And so why do I bring that up? I mean, what I'm trying to get at is that, ultimately what you're seeing is, people who, as part of this larger movement that we've seen really start brewing, really at the brunt of the pandemic, where, it's part of this larger kind of, I guess, backlash to the way schools go about, teaching, America's, history of racism, how it accommodates, trans students, right? I think what we've seen this session, particularly with the library bill, takes that a step further, right? And ultimately what the legislature is saying and what they've been very clear about is that they believe that parents need to be in the driver's seat. Now, obviously, a lot of the pushback, the question becomes, which parents are we talking about, right? Because, there are a lot of parents who show up and testify at the Capitol and other places whose voices, who they feel like their voices aren't heard. And so it's been interesting, but I bring that up is that it's been brewing is that you have these people who are, really, kind of locked in on, what's going on in different places. And, they're part of these kind of different movements or organizations and connected with different people who really across the country have made this, a thing over the course of the last, half decade or so.
Right. I mean, we're seeing, some of those people get elected. Representative Hillary Hicklin, that was sort of her origin story was, she got involved at school boards and in what she would say is like trying to get obscene materials out of libraries. And now she's in the State House carrying that legislature. So it certainly seems to be taking hold. This has been a sort of conservative, what's the word, like the field team to sort of, get up to the major leagues.
Just one thing about quick, like watching lawmakers listen to the excerpts from those books has been really interesting because you see almost how it's happening in real time. Because I don't think anybody would deny that the things that we're hearing at those meetings are like, whoa, like,
yeah, I know.
like, whoa, right?
Goodness.
But so it's interesting, right? The question becomes, obviously now we can talk about, whether certain things are out of context or, there's kind of nuance to it, but just in terms of the kind of lawmaking process, it's been really fascinating to kind of watch that up close. I've seen, Chairman, Brad Buckley, who's the House of the Public Education Committee, who they're sitting up listening to, the excerpts and in real time, you're kind of seeing things develop.
Yeah, just to your point about the politics of this, it's been interesting to watch. It's really been swinging back and forth, right? Because you saw that big wave of school boards, in South Lake and then beyond, where this became really a winning issue in school boards. This past May, when when the legislature was doing all these things, another thing that happened was a bunch of school board elections in which almost all of the school boards supported by this kind of, these PACs and these other forces, their candidates were voted out or lost, and so the pendulum kind of keeps swinging back and forth. And, I'm interested to see what impact this actually has. Are there really that many books in school libraries that have this kind of material in there? Is this going to have a material impact? Also, are kids still checking out these books?
Well, and I think a lot of it comes down to do you trust librarians to kind of run their library, right, and to be responsible of that. Chris, I'm curious, how have you felt sort of this rising tide of parental involvement or of scrutiny of the work you're doing? Have you felt that in your district?
Not a whole lot. I think our librarians are amazing, and I think they've been able to kind of run their library as they so choose. The thing that I find so interesting about this whole, like, we're going to ban these explicit books, like, kids can get all kinds of things on their phone.
Oh, yeah.
You know, so it's sort of like, why are what are your kids doing on their phone? Because it's probably worse than the book they're not checking out from the library.
Well, they can't take their phones to school anymore either, right? Isn't that?
They'll be developed, yeah. The one thing I was going to add, though, is that this bill, in my opinion, again, I'm not a lawyer, but it has legal challenge written all over. And the reason I say that is because there's a particular provision in the bill that, if a book gets challenged, it's pulled off the shelves, right? And so you get into this territory. We'll be curious to see, again, I can't predict the future, but it'll be interesting to see kind of what the, how kind of legal groups will respond to this. We know they've been very vocal about other legislation kind of in the same vicinity. And so it'll be, I don't think, the discussion is over on, obviously, it goes into effect, we'll see kind of, what happens after the fact. But I think folks will have something to say about it. Because again, what it does is it puts, really, what they're saying is that, these parents, they ultimately have the power to determine what the community's values are, right? And that's a big part of how the legislation, that's actually like specific like language in the bills. It talks about like community values. And so again, it's really interesting. I'll be curious to see how this also fits into like the national landscape as well. Given, again, Texas' size, it's always has outsized influence. But yeah, I think there's a lot still to be kind of written on this particular topic.
And certainly we've seen bills or laws like this get challenged in court and in some cases get basically knocked down. So yeah, I think that's a pretty solid prediction. Librarians not taking this laying down.
I talked to a librarian earlier, and one thing that really struck me was just like how much, I don't think people actually realize like librarians, I think she was telling me earlier, like, we're required to have master's degrees, right? Like we are, like this is a very like rigorous process. So we're not just people who just show up and just, scan a book, here and there. Like it's a pretty like hard job and like takes a lot of skill and talent. So I think that's why you probably saw a lot of the backlash. And it's like, we want you to understand exactly what we do, right? And we need to be at the table if you're making decisions having to do with our profession.
Right, yeah, trust us to do our job, sort of the gist. I want to briefly talk about an issue that a couple of the kids in the room might care about, which is the not dead yet STAR test, the attempt to get rid of this large annual assessment, and now lawmakers were unable to strike a deal, so the STAR test lives. Chris, can you talk a little bit about the STAR test? How do teachers feel about it, the students, and generally just like this teach to the test mentality I think lawmakers were worried about?
Well, testing causes a lot of anxiety for our students, especially I think in the younger grades. By the time they get to high school, they're a little bit more jaded about it, but it still takes up quite a bit of our time, making sure those kids, for example, have the English skills for the English test, or in our world, it's the biology test. I think teachers were not thrilled about the idea of 3 tests a year, so I think maybe that's good that that's gone. But yeah, testing is a challenging one, and I really wish there was more teacher representation with the people making these decisions that really have been in the classroom that understand. Like, I could never make a decision about how elementary school testing could go. Why is a legislator that has never been in the classroom before making those decisions for us? I'd love to see more teacher input on testing.
Definitely.
Yeah, it just seems like it's a very it's a good applause line if you're a politician to be like, we're getting rid of the STAR test because people don't like it and people don't like standardized tests, right? But then you kind of get into the nitty-gritty of like, okay, there needs to be some way to measure how successful schools are, right? There needs to be some way to hold them accountable, and then it starts to sort of break down from there, and it gets a lot harder, right? You just talked about, like, they were talking about 3 separate tests, which would have been maybe designed to, in their minds be a bit more effective of measuring. But then now you have 3 high-pressure tests throughout the school year that is also stressful for people, and it's I think it's less complicated on the campaign trail and more complicated when you actually get into how are we going to do this, and how are you actually going to make sure that our students are getting what they need in order to, succeed.
Yeah, I think one thing that we also have to mention a big part of that bill would, at least, in the Senate version, would have given the Commissioner of Education a considerable amount of authority when it relates to, basically what they were trying to do was lay the hammer down toward districts who sue, whenever they disagree about, the accountability system. And so, it would have honestly put them, they could have been, liable to have a conservator, appointed, in their district if they were to sue, against, changes made. And so, obviously, it was a big part of it was the test itself, right? And I think it's actually interesting. Like that was the one thing that seemed to have like somewhat kind of universal agreement was that like we need to get rid of the star, but ultimately, once again, it didn't happen. I'll be curious to see kind of it. Perhaps it sounds like they feel like they made some progress and momentum this session, just judging on, I was in Salado last week at the House Bill 2 bill signing. So I'll be curious to see like if this is actually, like if this was meaningful in the long term, where when they come back in 27, they're picking up, at a better place maybe than where they have in previous years. But to your point, we'll see kind of what happens.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're going to have to leave it there. But before we do, Chris, Jaden, I'm hoping you guys each, it was a huge legislative session for education, a lot of promises made, a lot of stuff changed. If you had to give the Texas legislature a grade on a scale of an A to F in terms of, Chris, I want from you, on the, promises upheld to teachers, Jaden, just generally, how are we feeling about how education made it through the session? Matthew, do you have thoughts on this before they do this?
No, go for
Great.
it. Just be careful, Jaden.
Yeah, just on how well did they uphold their promises from the beginning of session?
Okay, I have 2 grades. B+ on teacher pay.
Great.
Do schools get B pluses? I think the A through F doesn't do a plus or minus, right?
Okay,
This is her
B.
classroom. She can do what she
They get
wants.
a B.
Yeah, this is the classroom.
And then I think for funding of schools, D. I really would have liked to see some more of an increase in basic allotment to help fund basic operations for schools.
Yeah. Jaden, let's find out if you're ever going to hear back from Chairman Buckley again.
Yeah, I don't know if I have a particular grade. The one thing I will say is that I think what didn't happen in 2023 makes the perception of House Bill 2. It's a little bit difficult to celebrate for some people out in the public ed community, just because again, since the comprehensive funding bill did not pass in 2023. We're seeing school districts the size of Houston ISD that are considering closures. We're seeing budget deficits in droves. Obviously, we talk about our special education funding gap, which I know lawmakers made some significant changes this year that'll kind of chip away at that. But there are just some really significant needs, and so as a reporter, as I look at the situation, I think it's my job, right, to ask those questions of, yes, this is a moment that obviously you're celebrating. But there was a lot also left on the table, 2 years ago that are going to have lingering impacts. And then not even just 2 years ago, prior to that, schools as base funding, which gives them the flexibility to address operational costs and, the things that are unique to their campuses hadn't been raised since 2019. And so there's a lot of work the legislature has to do. I think I'm sure they understand that. And while, this is, they see this as kind of a historic, huge moment, I think, as I've been out, talking to districts and teachers, I think people are grateful for the money, grateful for the investments, but make no mistake, I don't think anybody's saying that the job is done and that, this is it. I think, Matthew pointed out earlier, I think the gap between, the money now and the 2019 funding levels is somewhere roughly $10 billion or something like that. So a lot of work to be done.
This is why they hate journalists. Yeah. We're like, good work, more to do, though. Yeah. Always, yeah. Well, thank you so much, first to Jaden for joining us, also to Chris Mihalsik. And that is this week's episode of the TribCast. And I think we're now going to take some questions. This will not be on the TribCast, so right. This is only if you're in the room or
in-person exclusive.
Exclusive.
Well, it is on the live stream.
Okay. Live stream exclusive.
Cut the live stream.
Just let me know.
Yeah.
Suzanne from the Hill Country asks, do you have thoughts on how HB 6 will impact student discipline, and overall, how the rise of discipline issues are impacting teacher retention?
Oh, Jaden told me to put this question on the list, and I was like, there's not enough time.
Yeah, I mean, the discipline thing is really interesting because, you know, it was roughly, and I wasn't here, so this is all revisionist, like as I'm looking back and kind of catching up. But, you know, about a decade ago, you know, you had substantial changes, you know, that basically limited, you know, how districts go about disciplining students. And a lot of that was looking at the data and seeing that, you know, it was primarily, you know, our Black and brown students who were being disproportionately impacted by discipline policies. Where obviously, I'm sure maybe you could speak to, since COVID, you know, nationwide, you know, I think discipline has been a huge conversation in schools. And what we saw this session was really a rolling back of all the policies that have been implemented, you know, about a decade ago. And what we're seeing now is that it would be easier for schools to you know, suspend students or have them in school suspension, to send them to DAP, which is the disciplinary kind of alternative education program. And so that's a huge bill, by the way. You know, we're talking about HB2, all those things. This is one of the, again, this was a huge session for education. This is one of those things that will have, you know, you have to imagine have lingering, you know, effects for years to come. But I'm sure you can probably speak to some of the discipline and how teachers are feeling and things of that nature.
Things have definitely been tougher since COVID. I think kids' social bonds have been more challenged. Like the year we came back from COVID, you had to really work with kids to get them to even interact. They've gone through trauma. Like kids have gone through trauma and they act out when they've gone through trauma. I never want to see kids off our campus though, because when they get sent to alternative placements, they don't learn as well. There's definitely learning. I don't want to ever say there's not, but it's a challenge, right? You want to keep kids in the classroom, but sometimes kids have challenging discipline issues, so it's tough.
Laura from Austin asks, any comments on how the voucher program may affect public high schools' fine arts programs? From what I've seen, at least at my school, they were the first to be hit by budget cuts.
Well, that's interesting. Getting very specific, but I think that's an interesting question.
There was an interesting thing that happened in HB2 where I think it was $15 million that was set aside in the House bill for a fine arts allotment.
Yeah, that's true.
And I think, you know, 15 million spread out over all the school districts in the state, I think is a pretty small amount, but at least sort of a starting point for, you know, starting to kind of ensure that there is funding, particularly for the fine arts in Texas. That did not end up making it through. I think it was stripped out in the Senate and did not come through in conference committee. But I would say that was maybe the most significant conversation around fine arts and arts in schools. You know, the question of, you know, if schools have more money, they probably will be able to spend more money on arts, right? As was sort of said, a lot of times when you're short on money, those might be the first things to go because there are certain things, you know, whether right or wrong, you view like we got to teach kids how to read, we got to teach them math, we got to teach them science, those types of things. Those will take priority over fine arts. Now that the schools have more money, some of that might protect some of those programs. But the decision to actually create a specific flow of money for fine arts ended up not going through, and will be interesting to see whether that comes back up in 2 years.
For sure. Yeah, a lot of, there were some actually fine arts teachers who showed up and testified and spoke to that, because I think the general kind of message is that, you know, obviously, you know, math, reading, all those things are important, but fine arts are the reason kids love going to school, right? You know, I grew up in Conroe ISD, which is actually Senator Creighton's district, so we kind of joked about that before, but, you know, I would say, obviously the academics were really huge, but where I developed, I think the most was in the extracurriculars. And I think that's true for students all across the state. And so I think the fine arts allotment that the House had proposed was kind of an acknowledgement of trying to give districts, you know, money to put toward that. And it does sound like that's going to be something they're going to pick back up on. If I remember correctly, I think Senator Menendez and Senator Creighton had a kind of a handshake agreement on the floor that they would revisit that conversation next session.
And actually, now that you mentioned, I think there was a study, like they're going to study it in the interim. So you know, a study
that'll change everything.
Melita asks, and apologies if this was discussed, but maybe going into a little more detail, what did the Ledge do to support early childhood education to support our little learners to prepare them for kindergarten?
Yeah, talk about one of the most confusing parts of House Bill 2. So I'm going to try to like relay it in like very human terms. Basically, there's a requirement, that districts provide full day pre-K, but it's still funded at a half day level. And so what they did basically was try to move some money around that ultimately help some districts. It won't obviously, solve the issue that, districts are paying out of their own pocket to fund something that's mandated by the state. But certainly there was acknowledgement that that they want to get there, and so I think that'll be another thing that they'll obviously visit is trying to find a way to get pre-K funded at a full day level here in the state. And then there are also some really interesting things as it relates to kind of early literacy, right? Trying to help districts catch students early on, kindergarten through third grade when they're struggling, because we know once you get past third grade, it's really difficult to catch up. The data would tell you that, and so they've implemented some kind of screeners and assessments that'll kind of ultimately the goal is for districts to better identify students who are struggling early on, give them more targeted supports that will obviously serve them well moving forward.
I know that Christine touched on this briefly, but for our Stephen says for our Teacher of the Year, first, congratulations.
Thank you, Stephen.
What are your thoughts on why teachers are leaving the field and what can be done to help retain good teachers? And I might just add to that, both from a legislative point of view, but also from community kind of cultural point of view.
I think one of the things that drives teachers to leave the profession, especially some of our seasoned teachers, is the workload. So I think decreasing class sizes, especially since they've gotten so big, like that's one of the reasons I gave them the D, because that basic allotment helps us decrease those class sizes. We get more teachers. So really working with workload, I think having really supportive communities is really, really important, like mentorship, that type of thing, also really important for helping teachers stay. Very important.
All right, with that, we will end our program and thank all of our panelists for joining us tonight.